Has the Western world gone mad? Or has Western civilization changed its relationship to mental illness? Did Michel Foucault predict this in 1961? The world is in a crisis it has not seen for 100 years. Old assumptions about who rules the world and how they rule are changing. And on the Burning Archive, I offer you calm reflections on history to help you through this crisis. This week on the Burning Archive, I engage in some speculative history about the history of madness and civilization, specifically Western civilization. Has modern society or new radical ideas or the powerful interests of medicine quietly made Western civilization insane? That is the question on today's Burning Archive.
What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee.
I am Jeff Rich. I am an independent author and podcaster, one-time historian, one-time retired government official, very, very minor retired government official, who is curious about all the world's cultural traditions of responsible statecraft, but also who has had a long and intimate connection with mental illness from many different perspectives. Now, mental illness might seem a long, long way from the big themes of war and empire and cultural decay in the multipolar world, or the challenges for democracy, but I, strangely enough, think that mental illness is actually quite central to all of those problems. And in the next few episodes, I'm going to bring together my personal encounters, my lived experience, if you like, with mental illness, and my own reading over decades in the history and culture of mental illness, or the less scientific term, madness, and my direct experience as a government official working on many of these issues. A very, very minor government official. I want to reflect on the place of mental illness, the cultural role of madness in some of those big changes, some of those biggest changes we have not seen for 100 years, some of those changes that are contributing to our sense that history is changing before our eyes, to our sense that there is a world crisis. And the metaphor of a world gone mad is fitting for a world crisis, which affects society and culture and politics and economies and competing civilizations, all of which have different traditions, different ideas, different cultures, and different experiences of insanity. Moreover, the idea that the Western world is going mad is actually a claim that some non-Western leaders have made about the West in recent years, especially in relationship to some of more extreme radical ideas about identity that are popular in some circles. And it is also a claim that some Western intellectuals used to criticize the West as decadent cultures or collapsing societies that are infected with epidemics of mental disorders, even celebrating or making cults of them. Comparisons are made to the last days of Rome or some of the strange, very strange cults that were incredibly influential in early 20th century Russia on the cusp of the 1917 Russian revolutions. But I'm not really wanting to engage in a discussion today about the collapse of Western civilization, rather, which I don't really think is happening, but rather explore how history shows that sometimes big historical turning points, when there are lots of changes going on, can change our ideas of madness or mental illness or sanity itself. The big changes in the world also have an impact on the inner mental world of our lives too. Mental illness changes in history and across cultures, and history and cultures change mental illness. It's a very complex phenomenon. So what I want to do to explore this idea is to reverse my usual order in the podcast. I usually talk about a big issue in the multipolar world, some history connected to that, and then a fragment of the burning archive, a text from the cultural heritage of the multipolar world. But I'm going to reverse that order today and talk about the fragment of the burning archive first, and then lead up to the big issue, which I have framed here already in this introductory discussion, which is really, are we seeing either Western society go mad or the experience of madness change Western society? First up, let's look at a fragment of the burning archive, and that's going to be Michel Foucault's 1961 book, The History of Madness, translated in an abridged form in English in 1965, with the title Madness and Civilization. So Foucault's History of Madness, La Histoire de la Folie, or in its abridged form, The Madness and Civilization, is a very famous and influential book in history, the culture, in political thinking, in ideas about mental illness and the history of psychology and psychiatry. And during the years of the pandemic, I sort of started to read again Michel Foucault's History of Madness, because the original book that he wrote in 1961 has only fairly recently been translated fully into English. When I was a university student, I had read Michel Foucault quite obsessively. Indeed, I read everything that Foucault ever wrote, even texts that were in French and that had not yet been translated, like his, at least fragments of his La Histoire de la Folie from 1961. But then when I became a very, very minor government official in the public service in Victoria in 1990, I largely put Foucault aside, a process that was quickened by reading some biographies of Foucault from the 1990s, which highlighted some of his inner demons, his cruelty, his sadistic temptations, and his, to be blunt about it, his exploitation of poor Algerian boys. And so I kind of discarded the theories and the radical melodramatic politics of Foucault's writing, even though he remains an incredibly influential thinker on, I guess, the left, and especially on the sort of, let's say, the kind of identity politics sort of left. But I always retained a deep affection for the text in which I first encountered Foucault. That includes some of his most rhapsodic historical metaphors, like chapters on the ship of fools in medieval culture, the mad artists of the 19th and 20th centuries, like Vincent van Gogh, and the great confinement, locking up of people with mental illness and other social deviants in the 17th century in France. Now, his book is enormously influential, but also enormously controversial. Some people describe him as a fraud, and the sociologist / historian Andrew Scull wrote a whole book called Madness in Civilization that was at times a somewhat peevish rejoinder to Foucault's account of the history of madness. And some of the controversy about that book relates to Foucault's own philosophical and celebrity intellectual trajectory. Even by 1972, 10 years or so after his book and after May 68 and various transformations in his personal and political life, he disavowed some of the more experiential pleas to hear the voice of the mad in his History of Madness in favour of a more pure, radical theory of culture, his sort of archaeology of truth, what he described as his archaeology of the human sciences. And in doing so, he really lost, I feel, the voice of the madness, the voice of the experience of madness that I had always found most appealing in his work, that actually made me interested in Foucault in the first place. The preface from the 1961 edition of History of Folly that I'll just read to give you a sense of that aspiration Foucault held at that point to recover from the burning archive, you could almost say, the voice of the experience of madness in history. So he wrote, and this passage gives you a sense of both the abstractions but also the poetry of Foucault's style. So he wrote in the preface, The History of Madness, the perception that Western man, forgive the gendered language, has of his own time and space allows a structure of refusal to appear on the basis of which a discourse is denounced as not being language, a gesture as not being an oeuvre, as in a work, French word for the work of an artist, a figure as having no rightful place in history. He's describing how the degradation of madness and mental illness as a sickness takes away all legitimacy from its voice in reasoned discourse. And he goes on, the necessity of madness throughout the history of the West is linked to that decisive action that extracts a significant language from the background noise and its continuous monotony, a language which is transmitted and culminates in time. It is, in short, linked to the possibility of history. This structure of the experience of madness, which is history through and through, but whose seat is at its margins, where its decisions are made, is the object of this study, which means that it is not at all a history of knowledge, but of the rudimentary movements of an experience, a history not of psychiatry or psychology, but of madness itself in all its vivacity before it is captured by knowledge. We need to strain our ears and bend down towards this murmuring of the world and try to perceive so many images that have never been poetry, so many fantasies that have never attained the colours of the day. That gives you a good sense of the style of Foucault's extraordinary work on the history of madness and the tensions in his own mind, because in the end he ultimately sort of turned his thinking into a history of knowledge, a history of psychiatry rather than a history of the experience of madness. And so that was the thing that always appealed to me in Foucault's text, this fragment of the Burning Archive, the Madness and Civilization, or the History of Madness. And it was the deep truth of Foucault's poetic history, that madness has a social and cultural history beyond the body, the brain, chemistry and genes, that continue to echo through my own experiences working in government, in my personal life, or in my reading of history and culture, my own experiences of mental illness over the 60 years since History of Folly was published in 1961. The way our cultures imagine or tell the story of their relationships to madness, I think, is changing again. It has changed enormously since Foucault wrote those words in 1961, and partly inspired by those words that Foucault wrote in 1961. And despite all the controversy about this text, generous writers from across the political spectrum have acknowledged the fundamental importance of this book. The measured British historian Roy Porter, who was a historian of madness, mental illness and psychiatry, said it was the most important book ever written on the history of madness. And the conservative philosopher Roger Scruton, who argued against so many of Foucault's ideas, nonetheless praised the extraordinary poetry of his style and the fertility of his imagination, his historical imagination. Now, I think today there are probably better books on the history of madness, but they are all influenced by this one. And so I do think that this is certainly one of those fragments of the Burning Archive that all listeners to the Burning Archive may wish to read. On the Burning Archive YouTube channel, I've just recently done a little video that's sort of reviewing five of the best books on the history of madness, including Michel Foucault's History of Madness. So you may want to go and check that one out. And as we have a short interlude between segments, let's just listen to Michel Foucault himself from a rare interview in 1965 in French.
Bien, par forme culturelle, j'entends, si vous voulez, la manière dont, dans une culture donnée, un savoir s'organise, s'institutionnalise, libère un langage qui lui est propre et, éventuellement, atteint une forme que l'on peut appeler scientifique ou que l'on peut appeler parascientifique. Alors, j'aimerais que l'on interroge la psychologie à cette racine. En quoi la psychologie est-elle, dans la culture occidentale, une forme de savoir, ce savoir pouvant être une science ou pouvant éventuellement n'en pas être?
De ce point de vue, quelle serait votre réponse?
Eh bien, je crois que la psychologie appartient à une certaine forme culturelle qui s'est constituée dans le monde occidental, peut-être.
So the second segment of the podcast connects a big issue in world affairs to real events in history. And today what I thought I would do is lay out the essential plot line of Michel Foucault's influential History of Madness as a bit of a background to the discussion of how ideas about mental illness are changing today. Foucault essentially sort of retells the classic heroic history of the birth of psychiatry, the altruistically inspired treatment, better treatment of people with mental illness, the taking away from cruel imprisonment, as a demonic tale of the entrapment of the mad by new institutions of power that entrap the mad in this category of mental illness. No longer do they have the more culturally powerful resonant category of madness, but they are stripped of any agency in truth by being defined as mentally ill. So if you like, sometimes there's an argument over the influence of biology and culture or social determinants of health and physical determinants of health on mental illness. And Michel Foucault is very, very firmly on the side of culture being the dominant influence. Changes in ideas, changes in philosophy and in social arrangements, social institutions, the way in which power is exercised over people with mental illness change the nature of mental illness itself. That is partly what he means by mental illness having a history. It's not the same physical phenomenon in different times. It is a phenomenon that is changed by our ideas of it. And he essentially argues that madness and medicine define each other in an antagonistic struggle, that madness or unreason, insanity, and civilization do so also. You can't define culture without defining its opposite of disordered thinking of the mind. So he argued in the Middle Ages in Europe, and primarily his evidence is really drawn from France. He was French after all, but from a range of places across largely Western Europe, Western and Northern Europe. He argued that in that period in the Middle Ages, the mad were sort of symbolic outcasts who were condemned to live in leper houses or be exiled from cities on the ship of fools. And while they were not well treated in that way, they were nonetheless given a kind of symbolic power. And then in the Renaissance period, there was a perhaps more accommodating idea of madness, perhaps symbolized by the fool in King Lear, who is like a truth teller despite his madness. There's a kind of a truth that's spoken in the words of madness that is kind of accommodated within a chaotic Renaissance society. But in the 17th century, in the Enlightenment, there occurs what Foucault describes as the Great Confinement. He wrote, "It is common knowledge that the 17th century created enormous houses of confinement. It is less commonly known that more than 1 out of every 100 inhabitants of the city of Paris found themselves confined there within several months. From the middle of the 17th century, madness was linked with this country of confinement and with the act which designated confinement as its natural abode." He really argued, I guess, that there was a strange shifting of symbols and discourse in the minds of Western culture in the 17th century that led to the imprisonment of madness, its confinement. And many, many historians have taken issue with the actual facts of what he wrote, and I think it's probably largely, discredited as a historical proposition, however powerful it might be as a symbolic story. Carrying on with the story, then in the French Revolution, in the 1790s, there is a famous French psychiatrist who unchains these imprisoned mad people and establishes new, more humane treatments. There's a particular moment in the 1790s which is celebrated in the benevolent history of psychiatry where the mad are unchained. And so this is really the birth of the asylum. But Foucault has a more dark version of the story. He doesn't want to grant that this was pure benevolence or the true scientific understanding of mental illness beginning. He wants to argue that modern psychology is really born with a kind of thinking about medicine and a kind of thinking about madness that turns the experience of madness, the experience of mental illness, into an object of science, an object without any real agency. Still, In Foucault's account of the history through the 19th and 20th centuries, the great cultural figures who experienced madness spoke out against this imprisonment within the idea, the scientific understanding of mental illness. They spoke out as the transgressive mad, and these are the great artists summoned in the closing chapters of Foucault's history. People like Antonin Artaud, the 20th century French playwright, Vincent van Gogh, Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who went mad, and poets like Nerval and Hölderlin, again, both of whom experience certain types of madness. Throughout this account, there is this strange double bind between the liberation and the protection of mental illness. And there is also a kind of millenarian hope embedded in Foucault's history. He anticipates a story where the excluded experience of madness would move from the margins of the culture to the centre and redefine what civilization was. Foucault's account was a kind of mixture of Marx and Nietzsche that imagined almost socialist utopia brought about by Nietzsche's transvaluation of all values and led by the socially marginalised, initially in Foucault's vision, the mad, later prisoners and other social groups. In 1961, when his book was published, the symbolic resonance of the mad artist or the dissident thinker trapped inside both narrow visions of art and the high walls of the asylum had a deep resonance. The great mad artist Antonin Artaud, author of The Theatre of Cruelty, had only died in a psychiatric hospital within a decade or so of Foucault writing his book. Indeed, Antonin Artaud made a memorable broadcast in 1948 of one of his strange texts, To Have Done with the Judgment of God, and I'll play a brief excerpt of that in the music transition to the next segment. But in the 1950s, 1960s, people were locked up for deviant behaviour in the USSR, locked up in asylums in the USSR, in China, and even some countries of the West for politically, socially, culturally inconvenient behaviour. As a result, Foucault's book really became a foundational text for anti-psychiatry, and in a way it was also the inception of a new kind of political thinking for the new left from the 1960s on in the West. It was part of the turn, if you like, from class politics, the Communist Party, to a more radical, broader set of radical progressive identity politics, encompassing feminism, gay liberation, and the experience of disabilities and mental illness and all sorts of other kind of experiences. Foucault's book was published in 1961, and his history, it really ends there, or ends even somewhat earlier than then. And a hell of a lot has happened in the history of madness since then. And the question for the third segment of the podcast is really whether some of those big changes since 1961 have changed again our understanding of madness.
Mangeons le pédote, à même le sol. Pendant qu'il naît. Et qui tue le soleil pour installer le royaume de la nuit froide. Et qui crée la courroie de l'espace afin que les esclaves de l'espace ne puissent plus jamais se rencontrer ni se croiser. Ainsi, vous allez mon attends, toujours. Seigneur!
the idea I want to focus on then in the third segment of the podcast that looks at a big issue in the multipolar world is this one of whether our world was not so much whether our world has gone mad, although that made a good introductory line, but rather whether we're witnessing something like one of Foucault's three great transitions in the understanding of the relationship between madness and culture in our own time. How we think about madness is central to our being, including those of us who are only mad when the wind is going north by northwest. And I think maybe this more generous understanding of the spectrum of mental disorders is part of this changed idea. The historian Pietikainen, who I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, but I'm doing my best with Finnish, wrote in his Madness, a history, that madness can be understood only in terms of degree and of the prevailing medical and cultural beliefs about human nature, normality and deviance, and these beliefs change when we move from one historical period to another. It's Foucault's idea expressed in much more moderate, finessed terms, and so too his understanding of the role played by people treating mental illness, doctors, psychiatrists, nurses, families, as well as those people experiencing mental disorders, is much more on the spectrum, if you like. He writes, "Some of us are completely crazy, others completely sane, but most of us occupy the grey zone where we are mad at sometimes, neurotic at other times, and most of the time not so sure whether our minds are truly in order or not." It's a long way from the more apocalyptic vision of Michel Foucault and also the more rationalistic vision of Foucault's opponents. But there have been quite a few arguments made in recent times that there are a whole lot of social, cultural, technological phenomenon which may even have an impact on our biologies, sleep patterns, or that sort of thing, that may be leading to changed experiences of mental illness. There have been arguments made that the excessive freedom to be whoever you want to be also imposes a kind of unbearable difficulty on people that can contribute to mental illness or mental disorders. There's been arguments made by people like Ian McGilchrist, the eminent psychiatrist and philosopher, author of The Master and the Emissary, and more recently of The Matter with Things, that modern culture is excessively, if you like, left-hand side of the brain focused, rational focus rather than imaginative and intuition focus, and that this manifests itself in specific kinds of disorders. He assembles indeed evidence that there has been a significant growth in the prevalence of schizophrenia and some other mental disorders over time. And there have been extraordinary things that have changed over the last 60 years that would contribute to a different experience of mental illness, a different cultural understanding of mental illness. Psychotropic medicine, especially since, I guess, the 80s, maybe the widespread use of SSRI medicines, deinstitutionalization of people with mental illness from the 60s, the increased advocacy of the lived experience and neurodiversity of people with mental disorders. And there's been enormous investments and changes and reforms and all that sort of thing in the care of people with mental illness themselves. But even so, the actual rates of mental illness do not seem to be decreasing. In fact, there is even some evidence that despite our greater understanding of things, mental illness has become more common. There's also the problem of the dilemma of higher rates of screening and detection. The more you know about how to identify illness or a problem, the way in which you give it a name, the likelihood of you detecting that also increases. And some people have even argued in a book by, I think it's Daniel Lord Smale, Deep History of the Brain, that there's a long-term interaction between the social and physical environment and the actual functioning of the brain. Greater prevalence of intoxicating substance in the social environment for humans and other sorts of things actually lead to not just changes in the culture, not just changes in not just a fixed biology, but an interaction between those two that actually changes the nature of mental illness itself and our experiences of madness. And of course, the whole movement launched by Michel Foucault of anti-psychiatry, if you like, of the voice of the mental illness, not launched by Foucault, but given an enormous boost by Michel Foucault. And in a way, also the broader message of the new left politics that was also became much more common since the 1960s. The whole idea that the personal is political has also changed our understanding. Cultural representation of madness is also changing, becoming more fragmented, and perhaps like those words from Peter Kainen, the Finnish historian, more simple and mundane. There's no longer the invocation of the dark prophets of madness like Artaud and Van Gogh and Nietzsche, and mental illness and madness can be, and mental disorders can be represented in a much more simple and ordinary way, including in shows like all sorts of television programs, for example. I'm not sure if how ideas of madness, of mental illness, are changing in an epoch-shaping way, as evoked by Foucault, but I suspect there has been a big, subtle shift in the culture and our culture's relationship to mental illness, which has many positive elements and many elements which we're still just coming to understand, perhaps need to be. That whole cultural shift also needs to be better understood when it comes to how governments respond to mental illness, so that all our systems for dealing with mental illness can respond to decentralised, fragmented systems of care, affection, and differing cultural ideas of the relationship between mental illness and culture. Is the world going mad, or are the mad changing the world? I think that it's more that the mad are changing the world, maybe for the better. It is more along the lines of the humane words of that Finnish historian who has written, I think, perhaps the finest patient-centred or human-centred account of the experience of madness that perhaps went back to Michel Foucault's original initial aspiration not to write a history of psychology, negative or positive, but to write a history of the experience of mental illness and madness, and to live mindfully in the world, as this podcast is an attempt to do, is a way to stay sane. And to stay sane in the current world crisis is a daily task, no small achievement. It's not surprising that the meme of the world has gone crazy is so common, but to live mindfully amidst this crisis, we must not drive ourselves mad with misleading narratives about the history of madness, mental illness, or insanity, or indeed the history of psychology, psychiatry, and systems of social control. Those narratives can tell stories of the triumph of science or the liberation of the transgressive mad. They keep evolving, and somehow or other we need to balance histories of derangement because they define the harmonies of the histories of our culture. Whether or not our big ideas and experience of mental illness have changed will be, I guess, a good topic for ongoing speculative history, a good topic to think about. But another way, I think, in which madness, mental illness has fed into this whole sense of crisis of our times has been the experience of the pandemic, which has provoked both crises in people's personal mental health as well as difficulties for the democracies that we live in, and highly contentious differing theories of whether the world all went a little bit mad over the last 3 years. So I'm going to look a little bit at those ideas in the next podcast, which will actually be episode 99. And then I'm going to have a special centenary podcast edition. And then I'll come back to look a little bit more again at mental health, mental illness, and explore why governments, in my experience, so often seem to mess up mental health. I hope you've enjoyed this program. Leave us a review and do share it around. You can also join my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com. I'd love to build the audience. Leave us a good review on iTunes and all that sort of thing. And do remember, until next time, what thou lovest well will not be reft from thee.
What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee.